The moment Officer Brandon Cole pointed toward the aircraft door, the entire boarding area went silent. Some moments change a career. Some moments expose a character. And sometimes, the difference between the two is only a few words. Hartsfield, Jackson Atlanta International Airport was moving with its usual rhythm that Thursday afternoon. Rolling suitcases rattled across polished floors. Boarding announcements echoed through the terminal. Travelers hurried past coffee stands, charging stations, and crowded departure screens glowing beneath bright overhead lights. At Gate B-27, passengers for Flight 482 to Washington, D.C. were settling into the final stages of boarding. Most people were focused on finding their seats and getting comfortable for the short flight. Few noticed Danielle Brooks as she stepped onto the jet bridge carrying a small leather bag and a navy travel folder tucked beneath her arm. She moved with quiet confidence. Her charcoal business suit was simple, professional, and understated. She wasn't trying to draw attention. She never was. Danielle offered a polite smile to the flight attendant stationed near the aircraft entrance before making her way towards Seat 2A in the first-class cabin. The seat assignment matched the boarding pass in her hand. Everything was routine. At least, it should have been. Before she could place her bag in the overhead compartment, a sharp voice interrupted the calm atmosphere. "Excuse me, ma'am. I need you to step back." Danielle turned. Standing several feet away was Officer Brandon Cole, an airport police officer assigned to assist with boarding operations. His expression was stern. His arms were crossed tightly against his chest. Several nearby passengers immediately looked up. Danielle glanced at her boarding pass. "Is there a problem, officer?" she asked calmly. Brandon's eyes moved from the ticket to her face and back again. "This section is reserved for first-class passengers," he said. A few travelers exchanged uncomfortable glances. Danielle remained composed. "I understand," she replied. "That's where I'm seated." Brandon didn't move. If anything, his posture became even more rigid. "I'm going to need you to step off the aircraft while we sort this out." The cabin grew noticeably quieter. The flight attendant nearest the front galley hesitated as if she wanted to speak, but thought better of it. Danielle felt dozens of eyes settle on her. Some curious, some sympathetic, others simply waiting to see what would happen next. Yet she showed no anger, no embarrassment, no fear. She simply looked at the officer and nodded once. "If that's what you want," she said softly. What nobody on that plane knew was that the next few minutes would reveal far more than a seating dispute. They would reveal exactly who people chose to become when they believed nobody important was watching. Danielle stepped back onto the jet bridge without protest, her polished shoes clicking softly against the metal floor beneath her. Behind her, the cabin door remained open, allowing every curious glance from the first-class section to follow her departure. The silence felt heavier than any accusation. People did not need to say what they were thinking. Their expressions said enough. Some looked uncomfortable. Others looked relieved that the attention had settled on someone else. Officer Brandon Cole followed a few steps behind, maintaining the posture of a man completely certain he was right. Near the aircraft entrance, a young flight attendant named Rachel Simmons shifted uneasily. She glanced between Danielle and the officer before speaking carefully. "Sir, her boarding pass did scan correctly." Brandon barely looked at her. "We are conducting a verification." Rachel opened her mouth as if she wanted to continue, then stopped. Danielle noticed the hesitation. She also noticed the worried look that crossed the attendant's face. It lasted only a second before professionalism returned. Around them, boarding had slowed almost to a standstill. Passengers waiting farther down the jet bridge began whispering among themselves. A businessman checked his watch. A mother traveling with her teenage son quietly guided him to the side. Everyone sensed tension, even if they did not understand it. Danielle remained calm. She adjusted the strap of her leather bag and looked through the aircraft doorway toward the rows of seats inside. The warm cabin lights spilled across the entrance, creating a sharp contrast with the cooler lighting of the jet bridge. It should have been an ordinary afternoon flight. Instead, the atmosphere felt strangely charged, as though something important was unfolding just beyond everyone's understanding. Brandon examined her boarding pass again. His eyes narrowed. "How long have you had this ticket?" he asked. Danielle met his gaze evenly. "Long enough to know it belongs to me." The answer was polite. It was also firm. For a brief moment, Brandon seemed irritated by her composure. He appeared to expect defensiveness or frustration. Instead, he found neither. Several feet away, another flight attendant emerged from the cabin carrying a tablet. She stopped abruptly when she saw Danielle standing on the jet bridge. Recognition flickered across her face before disappearing just as quickly. Danielle noticed it. So did Rachel. Neither woman said a word. Inside the aircraft, a notification chimed somewhere near the cockpit. Then another. Crew members exchanged brief glances. A message had arrived. Then a second one followed almost immediately. The mood among the airline staff subtly shifted. It was small enough that most passengers never noticed. Danielle did. She had spent years observing details that others overlooked. As Brandon continued questioning her, movement appeared at the far end of the first-class cabin. Someone inside the cockpit had just stood up, and whatever message had arrived seemed important enough to bring them out. Officer Brandon Cole noticed the subtle change among the crew, but he interpreted it as confirmation that his concerns had been justified. His confidence grew. Around him, the final passengers waiting to board remained frozen in uncertainty, watching an interaction that had become impossible to ignore. Danielle Brooks stood quietly near the aircraft entrance, her expression composed despite the growing attention. She had experienced moments like this before. Different places, different faces. The details changed, but the feeling was often the same. Someone decided she did not belong before learning a single thing about her. Rachel Simmons checked her tablet again. The screen displayed an internal notification she had never expected to see during an ordinary boarding process. Her eyes widened slightly. Across the cabin, another crew member received the same message. Neither spoke. Instead, they exchanged a glance that carried equal parts confusion and concern. Brandon continued speaking. Until verification is complete, you will remain off the aircraft. His tone was firm, the tone of someone accustomed to being obeyed. Danielle simply nodded. That is your decision, officer. The answer caught him off guard. No argument. No raised voice. No frustration. Just calm acceptance. Somehow, that seemed to bother him more than resistance would have. A businessman standing near the front row shifted uncomfortably in his seat. An elderly woman seated across the aisle lowered the book she had been reading. Even passengers pretending not to watch were listening carefully now. The atmosphere inside the cabin had changed. The normal sounds of boarding had faded into the background. No one seemed concerned about departure times anymore. Then another notification appeared on Rachel's tablet. This one caused her to inhale sharply. She immediately turned toward the galley and whispered something to a senior flight attendant. The older woman looked toward Danielle. Recognition flashed across her face. Genuine recognition. Danielle noticed it immediately. For the first time since stepping off the aircraft, a faint smile appeared at the corner of her mouth. It disappeared almost instantly. Brandon missed it entirely. The officer remained focused on proving himself correct. In his mind, the situation was simple. He believed he was preventing a mistake. What he did not realize was that several airline employees were now wondering whether the mistake belonged to someone else. Beyond the cabin door, the airport terminal buzzed with distant announcements and rolling luggage. Yet inside Flight 482, everything felt strangely still. Then the cockpit door opened. A tall man in a neatly pressed captain's uniform stepped into the first-class cabin. Captain Michael Reynolds was not scheduled to leave the flight deck during boarding. The fact that he had done so immediately captured everyone's attention. His eyes scanned the cabin once. Then he looked toward the jet bridge entrance. The moment he saw Danielle Brooks, his expression changed completely. And suddenly, every person watching understood that something important was about to happen. Captain Michael Reynolds walked forward with measured steps, his polished shoes barely making a sound against the aircraft floor. Every eye in the cabin followed him. The passengers who had been pretending not to pay attention were no longer pretending. Even Officer Brandon Cole seemed surprised to see the captain leave the cockpit during boarding. Rachel Simmons straightened immediately. The other crew members did the same. A subtle shift passed through the front cabin, the kind that happens when someone important enters a room. Brandon cleared his throat. Captain, we are handling a passenger verification issue. Michael Reynolds did not answer right away. His attention remained fixed on Danielle Brooks. For a brief moment, the noise of the airport seemed to disappear. The distant announcements, the rolling luggage, the conversations beyond the gate all faded into the background. Danielle stood quietly holding her travel folder. Her expression remained calm, But there was something else now. Confidence. Not the confidence of someone expecting to win an argument. The confidence of someone who already understood the entire situation. Captain Reynolds finally spoke. "Ms. Brooks." The words immediately changed the atmosphere. Brandon blinked. Rachel looked down as though trying to hide a reaction. Several passengers exchanged confused glances. The captain knew her name. Danielle offered a polite smile. "Good afternoon, Captain." The familiarity between them was impossible to miss. Michael nodded respectfully. "I apologize for the delay." Brandon shifted his weight. "Captain, we still need to verify." Michael raised a hand slightly. Not aggressively. Not dismissively. Simply enough to indicate he wished to finish speaking. The officer fell silent. The captain turned toward Danielle again. "We were informed you would be joining us today." A murmur spread through the nearby rows. Danielle remained composed. "I appreciate that." Michael's expression softened. "The crew has been expecting your arrival." Those words landed heavily inside the cabin. The crew had been expecting her. Several passengers looked toward Brandon. For the first time since the incident began, uncertainty appeared on the officer's face. Danielle glanced through the aircraft doorway toward the first-class cabin she had been prevented from entering. She did not appear angry. She did not appear interested in embarrassing anyone. If anything, she seemed patient, almost sympathetic. That made the moment even more uncomfortable. Imagine standing there after judging someone without knowing who they were. Imagine realizing that every assumption you made might have been wrong. Brandon looked between Danielle and the captain. Questions filled his mind. Who was she? Why had the crew expected her? Why were multiple notifications being sent throughout the aircraft because of her arrival? Before he could ask, a flight operations supervisor appeared at the end of the jet bridge carrying a tablet and moving far faster than airport protocol usually required. The supervisor looked directly at Danielle, then at Captain Reynolds. The concern on his face suggested that whatever explanation Brandon thought was coming, the truth was about to be far bigger. The flight operations supervisor reached the aircraft entrance slightly out of breath, clutching a tablet against his chest. The urgency in his expression immediately drew attention from everyone nearby. He nodded respectfully toward Captain Michael Reynolds before turning to Danielle Brooks. "Ms. Brooks, I apologize for the confusion," he said. "We were informed that you had already boarded." Danielle offered a courteous smile. "It appears there was a misunderstanding." The supervisor's eyes briefly moved toward Officer Brandon Cole. No accusation. No hostility. Just a look that seemed to raise more questions than answers. Brandon felt the attention shifting around him. Moments earlier, he had controlled the situation. Now he felt as though the situation was moving beyond him. Rachel Simmons glanced toward the supervisor's tablet. A name was displayed prominently across the screen. Whatever she saw caused her posture to straighten instantly. Nearby crew members reacted the same way. Passengers began whispering more openly now. A businessman in the first row leaned toward his seatmate. The elderly woman who had lowered her book earlier continued watching with quiet fascination. Everyone sensed that an explanation was coming, yet nobody seemed able to predict what it would be. Captain Reynolds accepted the tablet from the supervisor and reviewed the information. His expression remained professional, but a trace of concern appeared in his eyes. He looked back toward Danielle. "Ma'am, headquarters requested confirmation the moment you arrived." Several passengers exchanged puzzled looks. Headquarters. The word carried weight. Danielle nodded calmly. "I expected they might." Brandon frowned. The conversation felt increasingly strange. Headquarters did not usually track the arrival of ordinary passengers. Neither did flight operations supervisors rush onto aircraft during routine boarding. Something about Danielle Brooks clearly mattered. The question was why. The captain returned the tablet and glanced toward the cockpit. Additional notifications continued arriving throughout the aircraft systems. Crew members quietly acknowledged them one by one. It felt less like a commercial flight and more like preparations for an important inspection. Danielle noticed Brandon studying her. For the first time, uncertainty had replaced certainty in his eyes. She understood what he was experiencing. Assumptions often feel solid until facts begin to appear. Then suddenly everything becomes fragile. Beyond the windows, airport vehicles moved across the tarmac beneath the late afternoon sun. Ground crews continued their routines. Planes departed. Others arrived. The world outside remained ordinary. Yet inside Flight 482, Anticipation continued building with every passing second. Then a new message appeared on the captain's tablet. He read it once, then a second time. The supervisor saw it and immediately went silent. Rachel covered her mouth in surprise. Danielle remained perfectly composed. Imagine standing there while everyone around you slowly discovers a truth you have known all along. Imagine watching an entire room reconsider everything it thought it understood. Captain Reynolds looked up from the screen and took a measured breath. The next words he spoke would change the entire flight. Captain Michael Reynolds lowered the tablet slowly and looked around the cabin. Every conversation stopped. Every movement seemed to freeze. Even the passengers waiting farther down the jet bridge had fallen silent. The captain's voice was calm, but there was unmistakable respect in it when he finally spoke. Ladies and gentlemen, before we continue boarding, I would like to formally welcome Ms. Danielle Brooks aboard Flight 482. The words echoed through the front cabin. Brandon Cole felt dozens of eyes turned toward him. Danielle remained still. Her expression never changed. Captain Reynolds continued. Ms. Brooks is traveling today as part of a federal aviation oversight review. A ripple of surprise moved through the passengers. Several people exchanged confused glances. Others leaned forward to listen more carefully. The flight operations supervisor nodded quietly, as if confirming every word. Brandon frowned. Federal Oversight Review. The phrase sounded important, but he still did not fully understand what it meant. Then the captain continued. Ms. Brooks serves as the Director of Passenger Experience and Compliance Evaluation for the National Aviation Standards Authority. The silence that followed felt almost unreal. Rachel Simmons stared at Danielle. The businessman in the first row slowly lowered his phone. The elderly woman across the aisle blinked twice as if she had misheard. Danielle Brooks was not simply a passenger. She was one of the people responsible for evaluating how airlines, airports, and aviation personnel treated travelers throughout the country. Brandon felt his stomach tighten. Suddenly, every notification, every message, every reaction from the crew made sense. Headquarters had not been monitoring an ordinary traveler. They had been tracking the arrival of a senior federal evaluator. Danielle offered a polite nod toward the captain. Nothing more. No dramatic speech. No celebration. No attempt to embarrass anyone. The dignity of her silence seemed to fill the entire cabin. Captain Reynolds looked toward her again. We appreciate your willingness to travel with us today, Ms. Brooks. Danielle smiled faintly. Thank you, Captain. The exchange lasted only seconds, but its impact was enormous. Imagine standing there after making assumptions about someone you had never met. Imagine discovering that the person you questioned had spent years helping shape the standards meant to ensure fairness and professionalism across the industry. Brandon replayed the last 20 minutes in his mind. Every instruction, every comment, every decision. For the first time since the situation began, uncertainty gave way to something else. Reflection. Around him, passengers no longer looked at Danielle with curiosity. They looked at her with respect. Yet what nobody realized was that the captain had only revealed part of the story, because hidden inside the tablet was information that very few people on that aircraft had seen. Information explaining why Danielle's visit mattered far more than anyone in the cabin currently understood. The cabin remained silent long after Captain Reynolds finished speaking. Most passengers were still processing the first revelation. They believed they now understood who Danielle Brooks was and why the crew had reacted so strongly to her arrival. But the flight operations supervisor knew there was more. Much more. He glanced toward the captain, waiting for permission. Michael Reynolds gave a small nod. The supervisor stepped forward and opened a document on his tablet. His voice was careful and professional. There is one additional detail that should be clarified. Brandon Cole felt his pulse quicken. Something in the supervisor's tone suggested that the situation had not reached its conclusion. Danielle remained calm. She had not interrupted once. She had not corrected anyone. She simply stood there, allowing facts to emerge on their own. The supervisor continued. Ms. Brooks is not conducting a routine compliance review. Several passengers exchanged confused looks. The businessman in the front row leaned forward again. Rachel Simmons stopped pretending to organize paperwork and listened openly. The supervisor looked down at the screen. For the past 8 months, the National Aviation Standards Authority has operated a confidential initiative designed to evaluate real passenger experiences across major airports and airlines throughout the United States. The words hung in the air. Brandon felt a knot form in his stomach. The program focuses on identifying patterns of unequal treatment, procedural inconsistencies, and passenger service failures that may not appear during scheduled inspections. Suddenly, every detail from the past 20 minutes seemed different. Danielle was not simply evaluating facilities. She was evaluating people. The supervisor continued reading. Participants travel without special accommodations, advance identification, or public recognition. Their purpose is to observe authentic interactions. A quiet murmur spread through the cabin. Authentic interactions. Real behavior. Not behavior performed for inspectors. Real decisions made in real moments. Imagine believing nobody important is watching. Imagine acting exactly as you wish because you assume there will be no consequences. Then imagine learning that the moment you thought was ordinary was actually the test itself. Brandon's face lost color. The realization arrived all at once. Danielle had never announced her position. She had never requested special treatment. She had presented a valid boarding pass and followed every instruction given to her. Everything afterward had resulted from choices made by others. The supervisor lowered the tablet slightly. Ms. Brooks is the national director overseeing the entire initiative. A collective gasp moved through the front cabin. Even passengers who barely understood aviation regulations recognized the significance of that title. Danielle Brooks was not merely participating in the program. She was leading it. Captain Reynolds looked toward her with visible respect. Danielle offered a modest smile. There was no triumph in her expression, only professionalism. The flight that had begun as an ordinary trip to Washington now felt like something entirely different. And for Brandon Cole, the most difficult part was no longer discovering who Danielle was. It was beginning to understand what his own decisions had revealed about him. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. The cabin seemed suspended in time as passengers, crew members, and airport personnel absorbed the full weight of what they had just learned. Officer Brandon Cole stood motionless near the aircraft entrance. The certainty that had guided him earlier was gone. In its place was a growing awareness that every decision he had made had been observed, documented, and evaluated exactly as it happened. Danielle Brooks did not say a word. She did not need to. The facts now spoke for themselves. Captain Michael Reynolds glanced toward the flight operations supervisor, who quietly closed the report on his tablet. The supervisor then addressed the room one final time. The purpose of the initiative is not to punish people for honest mistakes. The purpose is to identify whether travelers receive equal treatment, equal respect, and equal access to services regardless of appearance, background, or assumptions made about them. Several passengers nodded slowly. The statement felt larger than the situation unfolding before them. It was about principles. It was about the standards people expected from institutions they trusted. Brandon lowered his eyes briefly. For the first time, he began replaying the encounter from Danielle's perspective rather than his own. He remembered her calm answers. He remembered her cooperation. He remembered that she had never raised her voice, never challenged his authority, and never attempted to use her position to influence the situation. The realization was difficult to ignore. Everything that had happened because of assumptions. Imagine reaching a moment where excuses no longer matter because the truth is standing directly in front of you. Imagine realizing that character is revealed most clearly when you believe nobody important is watching. Danielle finally spoke. Her voice was quiet, yet every person on the aircraft heard it. The goal of this program has always been improvement. The words surprised many people. There was no anger in them, no desire for humiliation, no demand for revenge, only professionalism. She continued, "Every traveler deserves to be treated with dignity. That standard protects everyone." The cabin remained silent. Even Brandon listened carefully. Danielle looked around the aircraft, making brief eye contact with passengers, crew members, and staff. "Most people do not remember the policies they encounter," she said. "They remember how they were made to feel." The statement lingered in the air long after she finished speaking. Captain Reynolds nodded thoughtfully. Rachel Simmons felt her eyes begin to water, not because of drama, but because the truth of those words resonated deeply. Across the cabin, passengers who had witnessed the entire incident seemed to reach the same conclusion. The most powerful moment was not the revelation of Danielle's title. It was the way she had carried herself before anyone knew who she was. And as Flight 482 prepared for departure, Another realization quietly settled over everyone present. The story was no longer about status. It was about the choices people make when they meet a stranger. The final passengers took their seats as the aircraft door closed and the cabin settled into a quiet hum. Outside the windows, the late afternoon sun cast long golden reflections across the runway. Inside Flight 482, however, many people remained lost in thought. The events of the past hour lingered in their minds. Officer Brandon Cole stood near the front of the aircraft for a moment before speaking. His voice was lower than before, stripped of the certainty that had defined it earlier. "Ms. Brooks," he said, "I owe you an apology." Every passenger within earshot looked up. Danielle turned toward him calmly. Brandon took a breath. "I made assumptions before I knew anything about you. That was wrong." The words were simple. There was no attempt to defend himself. No effort to explain away his choices. Just honesty. Danielle studied him for a moment. Then she nodded. "Thank you for saying that." The tension that had filled the cabin seemed to ease. Sometimes accountability does not arrive through punishment. Sometimes it arrives through recognition, through understanding, through the willingness to admit a mistake and learn from it. Brandon lowered his eyes briefly. He knew the evaluation process would continue. Reports would be reviewed. Conversations would take place. But at that moment, his greatest lesson had already arrived. It was not about regulations or procedures. It was about people. Captain Michael Reynolds returned to the cockpit, and the crew completed their final preparations for departure. Soon the aircraft began pushing back from the gate. Passengers fastened seat belts. Overhead bins clicked shut. The familiar sounds of flight returned. Yet the atmosphere felt different from when the journey had begun. Danielle finally took her seat in 2A. As she settled into the first-class cabin, several nearby travelers offered quiet smiles. Not because of her title, not because of her authority, but because they had witnessed her character. Throughout the entire experience, she had remained composed, respectful, and dignified. Imagine being judged before anyone knows your story. Imagine responding not with anger, but with patience. Not because it is easy, but because it is right. As the aircraft taxied toward the runway, Danielle opened her travel folder and reviewed the notes she had collected during previous evaluations. Then she paused and added one final observation. Not about policies, not about procedures, about people. Because in the end, every system is only as strong as the values of the individuals inside it. A few minutes later, Flight 482 lifted into the sky above Atlanta, climbing through scattered clouds toward Washington, D.C. The city below slowly disappeared beneath a blanket of evening light. Some passengers returned to their books. Others closed their eyes. Life moved forward. But many would remember what they had witnessed that day. They would remember that dignity should never depend on a job title, a uniform, a seat assignment, or the assumptions of strangers. And they would remember a lesson far more powerful than any official report. He thought authority gave him the right to decide who belonged. She showed everyone that respect should be given before identity is revealed. Because the true test of character is not how we treat important people. It is how we treat people when we believe they are ordinary.